Hi, everyone. This is Rebecca Strauss. I'm joined today by my friend and colleague, Sandy Andre. Hi, Sandy.
Good morning, Rebecca.
Good morning. Welcome to all of you. Some of you are still filtering in, but we do want to get started. There's a lot of questions. I think Sandy would agree with me that there's probably more questions than actual material to present. But we are going to try to get to as many questions about this topic as we can. We already had a few questions come in that are not really about this particular topic. So if we don't get to those, we're sorry. Please go ahead and reach out to us individually, or chances are we have already done a webinar on that topic. For instance, Public Act 238, we've done at least 2 webinars on that and when employees have to stay home and how long they have to be quarantined and all of that good stuff. That's all on our resource center as well as our website. So please feel free to look at those. Today, we are going to talk about remote work requirements. This is an issue that has skyrocketed in terms of employers' interest level, particularly after the governor had a press conference last week and kind of raised everyone's anxiety about when we can require employees to come into work and when we have to require them to stay home. That is the topic of today's webinar. Okay, it does not have to do with quarantine requirements or those types of reasons to stay home. We're talking just about MIOSHA and MDHHS and when remote work is required as a mitigation or a measure to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace. We are going to talk about primarily MIOSHA's remote work requirement. MIOSHA's emergency rule at paragraph 5, sub 8, talks about when remote work must be required. MIOSHA has also issued interim enforcement guidance and unusually helpful FAQs. It's not often MIOSHA or any government entity is really helpful to us these days, but MIOSHA was hopefully very clear in some FAQs we're going to share with you, giving us some guidance on remote work. We are going to talk to you about our recommended approach to this issue. And finally, we are going to talk about developments to watch, right? What is on the horizon here? What other relevant agencies have had to say about this? And this is a really good time to pause and remind everyone that today's date is November 10th and it is 8:04 in the morning. And whatever we say is relevant or accurate, I should say, as of 8:04 on November 10th. We have certainly had experiences where things change even later in the day of a webinar. So things are rapidly changing, as always, with COVID-19. So stay tuned as things develop. All right, let's start with the MIOSHA emergency rule because that is where our analysis should begin in this area. It was issued on October 14th. It is a temporary standard effective for 6 months. It may be renewed for another 6 months. I don't know about you all, but I have stopped predicting what's going to happen even a month from now, let alone 6 months from now. But it is the standard today. Rule 5 talks about basic infection prevention measures for all employers. And at sub 8, the rule says the employer shall create a policy, right, for all of the HR folks on the line. We do like our policies, and yes, spoiler alert, that is going to be one of our recommendations about how to comply with MIOSHA. So you need a policy prohibiting in-person work for employees to the extent that their work activities can feasibly be completed remotely. Okay, that is your standard. For the simplest questions, how do we know when employees can be required to return to work and when we still have to require them to work remotely? This sentence is the standard. Obviously, we're going to give you some more details and helpful advice on when and how to decide whether an employee can feasibly work remotely. That is the standard you should be focused on. The MIOSHA's interim enforcement guidance is helpful. It was updated last November 4th, so fairly recently. The penalties are up to $7,000 per violation. Willful repeated violations are up to $70,000 per violation. So fairly serious for most of the size employers we have joining us this morning. The remote work policy, they offered some very helpful information in their interim guidance on that. They said if there is a lack of implementation of remote work policy, it would be cited as a serious violation under Rule 4.1. The lack of the existence of a policy would be cited under Rule 5.8 as other than serious. Okay, so the lack of existence is a violation, but other than serious. That lack of implementation of it is serious. The existence of a policy may be established through written documentation of the policy or employee acknowledgement of the existence of the policy. Obviously, as lawyers, we want everything to be in writing, right? We want you to have a written policy, even better if the employee acknowledges the existence of the policy. Let's talk now about the FAQ. As I mentioned, very helpful FAQ from MIOSHA talking about what type of policy is required. So I'm just going to read this through for you because, frankly, it's better than me paraphrasing. MIOSHA recognizes that employers must determine who may work remotely as well as those who must report to work. It is essential that businesses have a thoughtful, reasoned policy for why work that is completed in person cannot feasibly be completed remotely. That's what MIOSHA is checking for. Here's the part you'll really like, guys. MIOSHA will not focus on evaluating the business judgment of feasibility, except for cases of obvious misapplication. Okay, so we can all breathe a little bit easier with that last sentence. The MIOSHA director had a Q&A. I don't remember if it was live or not, but it was a video and a webinar Q&A. And during that Q&A, he gave some sort of example of, if MIOSHA comes in to an employer that has 100 employees, let's just pick an office setting, and all 100 employees are working in person, they will dig a little deeper. If they walk in and a handful of the 100 employees are there, right, they're going to look at it much more favorably and probably presume that you do have some sort of policy, and if there's only a handful there, the handful probably need to be there. Obviously, that's not where their evaluation is going to end, but I will, before turning this over to Sandy, leave you with this advice. Do think about how it would look, right, if someone came in and generally the number of people you have on site versus working remotely, particularly, again, in office settings, obviously in manufacturing, retail, that sort of thing. It's very obvious why a lot of people have to be there in person. If it's not obvious, you may want to take a harder look at why so many people are in the workplace. With that, I am going to hand things over to Sandy, and she's going to give you the practical information on how to comply with the standard.
Excellent. Thanks, Rebecca. And as Rebecca said, what's really helpful and what has come from MIOSHA that is particularly helpful, I think, to us and our clients is this focus on action, right? We do care what your policy says, and we do care that you have one, but it's more important for us that you are doing the thing you said you were doing, and you're taking a good and thoughtful, reasoned approach with the backdrop of what our whole purpose here is, right? Having less people on site is a mitigation strategy, particularly in communities where community spread is increasing. And it feels like a matter of time, maybe before all of us are a close contact and we're staying home, right, under PA 238. So that's kind of the overarching piece of how all these pieces go together. So again, the focus needs to be on the action. But let's talk about our recommendations for compliance. So you remember that those MIOSHA documents said policy, and it can be written, or at least an employee acknowledgement that there is a policy. What makes sense here is that you do have something in writing, even though, we could argue that you don't need that, but it makes sense to go ahead and do that, as Rebecca mentioned. There's a couple different ways that you could do that. You want to, what may be easiest, because you all have, of course, a COVID-19 preparedness and response plan, is to include a written statement regarding remote work in that plan. And you want to take a look at the language that's required under the MIOSHA emergency rule and just plop that in there, right? So employees should be working remotely if it's feasible. In deciding whether an employee can do that, here's the things that we're going to consider, and you can kind of paint those broadly, right, in this kind of policy language. And then you'll want to put something in there, something to the effect of, if you've been asked to work on site but believe it's feasible for you to work remotely, please contact a supervisor or human resources. Because if you remember, another MIOSHA standard is making sure employees have a method to report unsafe work practices. And so in theory, if they're working on site and they think they shouldn't be, from a MIOSHA standpoint, that might be an unsafe work practice. So you'll want to just pull those pieces together, right? The company, our policy is that folks are going to be working remotely when they can feasibly do so. We have a process that we're going to implement to evaluate whether folks can work on site. However, if you are working on site and you feel it's feasible for you to work remotely, here's who you should contact. So those are kind of the three pieces. For those who are subscribers to the Resource Center, we have added language that covers those pieces to the template preparedness plans we have there. So those are updated for you. The second piece that might be helpful for those who want to really drill down and have something much more specific is to consider potentially a standalone remote work policy, right? That goes more into again, a kind of a formal policy that talks a little bit more about the parameters of how the company will evaluate whether work can be feasibly performed on site. And this may make sense regardless of the size of organization you're in, but might particularly be a helpful kind of a guidepost document, quite frankly, if you've got multiple people doing this analysis, right? If you're the person in your organization charged with doing the entire analysis, right? If it's Sandy Andre and I'm doing it for everybody, I know the things that I'm using, but if you're relying on people to do this all over in multiple locations or in multiple departments, you want to have some guideposts to make sure everybody's on the same page and thinking about the same types of considerations. So as Rebecca mentioned, what makes sense, some on-site presence is pretty obvious, right? So if you've got somebody who's working on a manufacturing line, it's pretty clear that they need to be there. But for other positions, it's not quite as obvious. And so to the extent that you develop a form or a policy where an employee and a supervisor can identify job responsibilities that require on-site work, but also allows for consideration of other factors, right? It's not just, whether I can do my work at home, but do I have a dedicated and private remote workspace remotely? Do I have access to technology? All of those pieces. From what we have heard directly from MIOSHA, it doesn't appear that they are interested, right, in splitting hairs with employers who've engaged in a process, right? Remember, they said a thoughtful, reasoned approach. They want you to be able to articulate, well, yes, this is how we decided that Sandy Andre needed to be on site today. And if you can talk about those pieces. So to the extent that you're interested in a remote work policy and kind of a form that walks through that exercise, we do have a form that serves the purpose and a policy up in our resource center for subscribers there as well. But again, the focus, right, is implementing a process to show the reason on-site work. So, what we always say, we can have our policies say the best things and have the best language, but it's most important that we implement and we're doing the things that the policies say, or the policies actually become kind of unhelpful to us. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide and talk about what some of those considerations might be. So as we mentioned, some positions it's going to be relatively obvious. Right, the example I gave, if you're working on the manufacturing line, if you're working at a drive-through, right, at a fast food establishment or something, I can't do that from my home office, right? So those things are on site to the extent that you're open and your customers, you've got business. Those things need to happen on site. But other things like office work, you need to make sure you're implementing a more thoughtful type of assessment process. And we've included some considerations here that we think are relatively important, right? So for those positions, we want to think about, are there machines or equipment that's only present in the workplace? Do folks must have direct contact with customers or members of the public? Or even generally, are they generally responsible for direct oversight of on-site operations or personnel, that those things become unfeasible if they're doing remotely. Otherwise, we want to think about additional pieces, right? So let's think about the impact on customer relationships or client demands. Certainly, if any of our businesses know anything about the last 6 months, we've understood how our own client demands have waxed and waned, right? So there may be times when it's incredibly important for people to be on site just based on your own customer demand. But as customer demand wanes, maybe it makes more sense to make that transition back to having folks work remotely, or identifying dedicated days that folks work on site and days they work home, because there are always tasks that must be done on site, as an example. We want to think about potential costs to the company for coordination of remote work. So one of the pieces that MIOSHA has said directly, the workplace safety director has said directly, is they're not interested in having organizations, spend ridiculous amounts of money to make sure everyone in their organization has VPN access and buying high-speed internet and. So if that's a consideration, and again, that can be person to person, right? So maybe, as I look at Rebecca and maybe I live out in the country and high-speed internet is not happening for me, but Rebecca lives in the city and that's not a problem for her. And so we need to think about some of these considerations as being job and position specific. That obviously makes sense when we think about job duties, but each of us comes with our own unique set of circumstances that may make remote work more or less feasible, and those are perfectly appropriate for an organization to consider as they're going through this analysis. And so we talk about impact on operations, even impact on coworkers. Are you in an environment where face-to-face kind of team meetings or collaboration are particularly important? And then as we turn to looking, again, specifically at the employee, do we have an employee who has a history of job performance that says, hey, this person needs direct oversight for a number of reasons? That's a perfectly appropriate consideration. Also, where am I working? Are there any technology or security concerns related to the type of work I'm taking home and who else may be in my home that may have access to that, or the type of information that I'm sharing back and forth with colleagues electronically? Is there an additional piece of security that needs to happen to make sure that we're not, that information stays confidential and safe? Again, talking about availability of technology resources. I talked a little bit about high-speed internet as an example. And then, of course, availability of a conducive remote work environment. So if I'm home and my spouse is home and my 3 kids are home, for some people that's going to be fine because there's still a carved out space in their home or their remote work location, and it's perfectly fine. And for other people, that's just not going to work. So in addition to thinking about just the kind of job responsibilities, right? Those words on the job description to say, yes, this can happen when we're remotely, no, this can't. It's all of those person-specific considerations that make a lot of sense and are perfectly appropriate to consider as you think about this question. Next slide, please.
Sandy, I would just say, every item on the right side of the slide, those are all the reasons I'm in the office today. For everybody wondering where I'm broadcasting from, I am in my office, and it's for all of those reasons. Okay, Sandy, back to you.
Yep, absolutely. Perfect example. What's additionally important, and so again, hopefully if we've learned anything in the last 6 months, that nothing seems like a one-time only exercise these days, right? So once you kind of come up with your list of things or considerations as you're looking at Sandy Andre's job and making a decision about where she needs to spend her time, remember that this is ongoing. We talked about ongoing from a customer standpoint, right? As customer demands ebb and flow, it's appropriate for me to pull Sandy back on site or to send her back home, or for Sandy's own personal circumstances. If those change, it might make sense for Sandy to be pulled back on site or stay at home, all of those pieces. Remember, you're going to want to put something in your policy that carves out an expectation for an employee to work on site when that becomes required, right? So, hey, we've done this evaluation on Sandy and her work, and we generally believe that she can do all of her job duties remotely, but we can't see into our crystal ball, and we have no idea if something is going to change tomorrow. And so our expectation is that as the need arises for Sandy to come on site, we want to carve out that expectation and make sure that Sandy understands this. This isn't the golden ticket to just stay home in her basement working in her pajamas, to infinity and beyond kind of a thing. We want to make sure that we're on the same page with the employee about that expectation, but also take that opportunity to reiterate, hey, Sandy, when you do come in, remember, these are the expectations that apply to you when you are working on site. And we're talking about following all of those health and safety safeguards in our preparedness plan, going through the daily entry self-screening process, all of those pieces. So this is kind of a nice way to button all of those pieces together. And then as it's appropriate, right, we want to talk about, we don't want to just send, Sandy home and give her no expectations for what we mean about how she performs her work. It makes a lot of sense before things go left or right here, that we lay out some expectations for how Sandy will perform remote work, right? We want to say performance expectations. Hey, Sandy, we still expect you to XYZ. These reports that you do weekly, we still want them weekly. These conference calls that you hold, daily, we still want you to do all those things, all of those pieces. Particularly important, right, for your non-exempt folks, we want to be very clear about how they're recording their time and making sure that we're paying them for all the time that they work, that folks are communicating back to whomever it's appropriate at the organization if they're going to take days off, just as if they were on site, right? We don't find out that Sandy takes a vacation day just because she doesn't show up at Miller Johnson. There's a process that goes along with that, right? And so just because Sandy's working at home doesn't mean that we can't continue to have those expectations in place. And then, of course, to the extent that we're going to be supplying equipment or Sandy's going to be taking items, from the office home, we're going to want to put a fence around. Here's the equipment we're providing you. It is property of the company. Here's our expectations for how you maintain it. All of those pieces. And remember here, and I think we've said this a couple times, and I just want to hit it again, this isn't an all or nothing kind of approach, right? And so it's not, Sandy either works 40 hours a week in her home office or she works 40 hours a week, on site at Miller Johnson. It's, hey, there's there's a portion of her job that has to be on site. but there's a lot of her job that doesn't. And so maybe what makes sense is to say, hey, Sandy, 1 day a week, we need you to work on site. And that's when you'll do all the on-site things. And the other days of the week, you work remotely. And again, consistent and continuous kind of ongoing evaluation process for those in the performance improvement world, right? You think of that plan, do, check, act kind of cycle, and that's exactly what needs to be happening here as circumstances change. Okay.
Sandy, we have, I'm glad we're moving on to this next section of the presentation, because we have received quite a few questions while you were speaking about the MDHHS statement, right, about when remote work has to be required and how that fits in with what we just said. Because for the people paying attention, you will note, you probably, some of you did in your questions, that what we just said may be inconsistent with what the MDHHS said recently. So for all of you that asked that question, thank you. We thought you would. And Sandy, why don't you fill everyone in on that guidance, the MDHHS guidance, and how that fits in with what MIOSHA has said.
Yes, thank you. Our clients are totally on the right page. We all had a crystal ball, yes. So to catch folks up, last Friday, MDHHS issued a guidance document entitled Keeping a Safe Workplace, and here's just a screenshot of it, and it's up on their website. And what's important here first is that unlike the MIOSHA emergency rules, this is not a binding rule. So remember, a couple of weeks ago when MIOSHA issued, I guess we're almost a month ago now, when MIOSHA issued their COVID emergency rule, that became a MIOSHA standard that has the force and effect of law. And for an employer who does not follow all of those 11 rules and their subparts, they can be cited under the MIOSHA Act for not providing a healthy workplace. That's a standard. This this MDHH document is not part of their emergency order piece. And even remember, a couple of weeks ago, MDHHS took out the workplace safeguards portion of their own emergency order, right? So they've said, they've signaled, we're removing that, and MIOSHA is the agency that enforces worker safety and workplace safety. We'll all be honest here that this guidance from MDHHS was surprising that it was coming out of their office, not surprising based on a press conference that the governor had last week. So essentially, this guidance reiterates some of the workplace protocols already required by MIOSHA, so that's good. But it also recommends a standard for remote work that generally appears to be significantly more strict than what MIOSHA seems to be requiring, and seems to allow in-person work only when it's obviously necessary. So, right, remember the examples I gave, manufacturing or I'm working at a drive-through, those are generally obvious. They think that's where the line is. Anybody who doesn't fall in one of those obvious categories, it's not then up to the employer to do kind of this reasoned approach to evaluate everybody else. It's no, the expectation is you keep all of those people out. And in fact, the MDHHS recommendation talks about employers should only permit in-person work when attendance is strictly required to perform job duties. And that strict requirement standard, they say, means that a worker is unable to physically complete required job tasks from a remote setting. And it should not be construed as permitting in-person work solely because working remotely may result in decreased productivity or efficiency, or because there may be additional costs related to performing remote work. So a couple things. First, I think it's really important that, again, we remember from an employer workplace safety protection standpoint, MIOSHA rules are the rule. And what I think is particularly helpful is what the FAQ, the MIOSHA FAQs say. Again, those FAQs are also just guidance, but we've got an interpretation from the agency who's actually the enforcement arm for these rules that Rebecca shared with you a couple of slides ago, saying this isn't a requirement, right? MIOSHA is saying we're not going to second guess as long as we feel that a thoughtful, reasoned approach has been taken. We've also got interim enforcement guidance that Rebecca talked about a little bit ago that were issued just a day or so before this MDHHS statement, talking about how it would enforce the remote work requirement, and we don't see any type of this language related to a strict requirement. So take all of these things together and go, okay, thanks, Sandy, for that, lesson about how to interpret agency statements, but what, right? What do I do now? So there's a couple different approaches you can take, right? MIOSHA is never going to slap you on the hand for taking a more strict approach to on-site work. If you want to follow this MDHHS guidance and that's the approach that you want to take, absolutely, completely fine. And a fine mitigation strategy, that's fine. But to the extent that some of the pieces they list in their guidance document, right, efficiency or additional costs, that you think that those are real impediments, right, to allowing your employees to work remotely, and the MIOSHA rule is the rule. Okay. Now, to the extent that you have documents that say, hey, we're going to follow every CDC guidance, OSHA guidance, MDHHS guidance, MIOSHA guidance, well, now this MDHHS guidance is in our atmosphere here. And so to the extent you have statements that say things like that, you need to make a decision of whether you're going to follow this. And if you're not, we need to go back and revise some of those statements. But at the end of the day, this MDHHS order is not binding, but it's important for our clients to understand it exists, because you may then have employees saying, hey, I think this is the rule. What about that, employer? And again, to me, I see all these pieces going together, right? You don't want to be caught off guard that something like this is out there, but presuming that you've implemented a policy in this thoughtful, reasoned approach, and you feel very confident in the reasons that Sandy Andre needs to be on site, you simply reply to Sandy Andre and say, yep, we're aware, but this is the rule, and these are the things that we've considered as it relates to your job, Sandy, and your circumstances, Sandy, and this is why we've determined you need to be on site, okay? The other piece.
Can I just interject for just a second before we move on to legislation?
Absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt. Two thoughts on this MDHHS matter that Sandy, of course, I share all of the thoughts that Sandy already shared with you. We did a webinar last week on the new immunity statute in Michigan that talks about if businesses comply with all of the various laws designed to limit the spread of COVID-19, then they would be immune from lawsuits seeking damages if someone was exposed to COVID-19. This MDHHS guidance is guidance, and if you did not follow this guidance, but only followed MIOSHA as well as all of the other rules and laws out there, you would still be entitled to that immunity, okay? Because as Sandy said, this is guidance, this is not a rule or a law. So for those of you that have that question on your mind, please know that this guidance is not included in that immunity statute and does not require you to follow it. The other point I want to make sure I add is just to, I guess, emphasize something Sandy mentioned. Your employees are aware of this MDHH guidance, right? They are aware of it just like all of you are that typed in the question and sent the questions ahead of time to us about it. So this becomes, in my opinion, more of an employee relations issue than anything else. And you may want to make decisions on a case-by-case basis about whether you're going to require someone to come into work or whether you are going to require them to stay at home based on the individual circumstances and whether that employee wants to be at work or wants to be at home. Employees kind of fall into two buckets here. Some really want to stay home and will be angry with you if you tell them they have to come into work. Others really want to come into work, right, and want you to work, want you to help them find the argument to get them back in. Whenever you do something that an employee does not want you to do, in this case, particularly bring an employee back in person that really wants to stay home, that's where kind of your risk enters the equation, right? And that's at the point where you may want to pick up the phone and talk it through with Sandy or me or someone else when you're trying to figure out what standard you should apply and whether you should actually require that employee to come into work or not, right? That's where the complaints, the lawsuits, et cetera, could arise from, are those situations. Okay, Sandy, what else do people need to know about this world we're living in when it comes to working at home?
Yeah, yep, all excellent points. Thanks, Rebecca. And so related to legislation, again, for those of us who have lived through the last month, we've seen, as a result of the October Michigan Supreme Court decision related to executive orders, we've seen a slew of legislation come through that either codifies some of those executive orders, the general spirit of the executive orders with some differences, all of those pieces. So we would not be surprised if we perhaps saw some legislation potentially on this point. It's kind of a 50-50 split, even in our section here at Miller-Johnson. Do we think something's going to come down the pike, or do we think it's all just going to come from the MIOSHA rule, right? What are they signaling? But we've all become really bad guessers over the last several months. And so we just want to make sure that in addition to whatever MDHHS might be saying, whatever MIOSHA might be saying, there, of course, is always potential for legislation. And we are, of course, watching that very, very closely. And you will hear from us if there is a development on that front in this area. Next slide, please. Just a couple more quick things here. I jokingly refer to as pre-COVID world as the before times, right? And so I think it's really easy in this COVID world that we're living in to forget how we all used to do all the employment things, right? So when we had an employee come to us and say, hey, I have a medical condition and I need to request to work remotely, all the time, part-time, certain days, so on and so forth, we generally knew how to approach that. The same thing applies here, right? So just because we have this MIOSHA rule that says how we must handle, right, and implement a policy, we still have an opportunity to evaluate these on a very interactive and case-by-case, fact-specific type of basis when we get any kind of specific request from an employee, based on a medical condition. And one of the questions that we got ahead of time kind of flipped this question, right? So we had thought about, remember that allowing an individual with a disability to work at home can be a form of reasonable accommodation, but we got a question, hey, can allowing an individual to work only in the office, to not work remotely, can that be a form of reasonable accommodation? And I hadn't particularly thought about it, but yes, of course, right? Depending, and we're going to go through the same analysis that we would do if we were going the other way, if the request was to work from home, or if the request was I need more frequent breaks, or if the request was, fill in the blank. We'll want to go through that ADA analysis. And lucky for us, the EEOC has provided us what some of those considerations can look like too. So building these types of considerations into your general remote work analysis is perfectly appropriate, but we definitely know that it's the way to go in the considerations to build into our formal workplace accommodation type of analysis, right? So it's important for us to remember that all of those normal rules, pre-COVID time rules, still apply to us, and we need to build those into our processes. Next slide, please. So here's the slide to print out, and here's your checklist, right? So what do I need to do? Thanks, Sandy and Rebecca, for reviewing all those things, but what do I need to do? So here's our recommendations. You need to adopt a policy, and whether you put that in your preparedness plan or adopt a standalone policy is totally up to you, but go ahead and adopt that policy. Then go ahead and implement it, right? So MIOSHA's told us that's where they're focusing, is on the implementation, not the words on the paper. And so to do that, you need to analyze each position and each employee to determine what job duties and the employee's specific circumstances might make it appropriate for the employee to be on-site or remote, or 50-50 or whatever that might be. And then we recommend some type of documentation showing that, right? The easiest way to demonstrate to MIOSHA that you've put forward a thoughtful, reasoned approach is to simply show them the document. And so to the extent that you think a form kind of walking through that analysis is helpful, that's perfectly appropriate and something that we recommend and have available for you. Okay. Now, let's finish up by looking at a couple of questions. A couple of these we've gotten before, and certainly, Rebecca, if you've seen some that come in that seem to be a little bit thematic that we can discuss here too, that works perfectly fine as well.
Sandy, the first question, numerous questions before the webinar, and definitely a theme of questions that came in during the webinar. So we're not going to ask any one of those particular questions. I'm just going to group them all together. And let's just, Sandy, discuss this designation, essential employee, and maybe even broaden that out to an essential business, because some questions were asked that way. Does the analysis differ at all if I'm an essential business? Does the analysis differ at all if it is an essential employee? I know you and I talked about that at length in the past. What do you think?
So I think the short answer is no. To the extent that you are an essential business or someone is an essential employee, I think that is a helpful fact for you to use to justify that person working on remotely, but it's not the golden ticket that says, oh, I just happen to work at this type of organization or for this type of an employer, or even this happens to be my job title, and so I don't need to give any more thought to whether Sandy needs to be on-site or not on-site. Where this gets tricky, and again, as Rebecca mentioned, she and I have talked at length about this, about all of the different ways this comes into play, and I think why it's confusing. Way back in April, when most things were shut down, remember, at that time, the only businesses that were allowed to operate were folks kind of designated in this critical infrastructure type of nomenclature, right? They're borrowing that kind of designation from the federal government generally. But also there was a handful of other types of jobs, and one of them was, hey, I might not be working for a business in the critical infrastructure, but I am performing a minimal business necessary type of operation, right? So maybe I'm the payroll person, and payroll has to be processed on site every Thursday. And so I've got to be on site every Thursday, even though our business isn't part of the critical infrastructure. And so we kind of started to colloquially refer to all of those types of jobs and those types of businesses as essential employees or essential employers, so on and so forth. But once we started to move away from this stay home order and transition kind of into the safe start order, some of those designations went away because almost everything was opened back up. There were just some limitations on capacity and things like that. And so there was no longer kind of this designation in terms of who can be operating on site, who can't, so on and so forth. And certainly, we know, right, the Michigan Supreme Court invalidated the executive orders back in October. And so we know that the executive orders, at least as how we think about them today on November 10th, that isn't necessarily a relevant consideration. Where this gets tricky, of course, is that there's a whole host of other statutes that talk about or that exclude certain types of employees or employers from having to do something because of this kind of designation as being, and I'll use this term kind of broadly, frontline. So for example, we're not going to get into this, but Public Act 238, there's some exceptions in there, right? If I am an employee that falls into one of these exceptions, my employer doesn't have to require me to stay away from the workplace if I'm a close contact of a COVID positive person, if I'm asymptomatic, right? There's some carve outs there. Even as we look at the FFCRA, we've got this exception or exclusion for folks who fall into the definition of a healthcare provider or an emergency responder, that employers don't have to provide FFCRA type of paid leave protections to those employees with the thought that we need those employees on site. And to even complicate things even further, the CDC and many of our local public health departments are following kind of this critical infrastructure type of analysis to determine, again, if I'm a close contact of a COVID positive person, but I'm asymptomatic, they are using this critical infrastructure designation to determine if I need to stay out of the workplace. So it's all those pieces together that I think are muddying this question. But specifically as it relates to remote work, right? I've said a lot of words, but remember the words I started with, right? The short answer is no. That designation doesn't matter on its own to the extent that you work in a critical infrastructure employer or you are one of these people who are a minimum business operations type of job. Those are facts that are helpful to justify why Sandy needs to be on site, but the analysis cannot just end there, okay? That's a really long answer, but I hope it fills in why this term is still out, and we do think about it often, but as it relates to this analysis, the answer is by itself, it does not justify on-site work.
I couldn't agree more. I could say it all over again. The only thing I would add is everyone should keep in mind that even back in March and April and May, work that could have been done remotely should have been done remotely. Mm-hmm. If you were critical infrastructure, even if your business was in critical infrastructure, and even if your employee was necessary for minimum business operations. However, and then as Sandy mentioned, we started referring to all of those people, kind of lumping them together as essential employees. But the rule was always, work that could be done remotely should be done remotely, right? That has not changed. All right, let's finish up the questions on this slide. Actually, Sandy, the second bullet point you already answered. You predicted that I would have asked this question on this slide, so let's not take time with that. ADA reasonable accommodation question. The last bullet point also groups together several, well, let's just call it a theme. Is better teamwork, or let's call it other soft issues, okay, that can't be measured. Are those types of reasons adequate for an employer to require people to work in person?
Yeah, and I think the answer to that is maybe even the same as, right, our conversation we just had on essential employee. On its own, I don't think it's enough, but as a piece of a whole, in that you can show the impact on operations, the impact on serving clients, customers, patients, whoever your customer base is, all of those pieces, to the extent that you can show how it negatively impacts the work that your organization does, I think it absolutely can be a relevant consideration. But on its own, no, I don't think that's enough. And again, I think, as we've talked about, that certainly there may be clear lines that we can draw by job titles, but much of this needs to also be employee specific. And so we gave a couple of examples, right? If I'm an employee who has trouble concentrating or doesn't have a remote or, conducive work environment. And so it's going to be better for me, better for the team, better for the organization to be on site. Those are all really relevant and important factors. And again, let's go back to MIOSHA's focus is on a thoughtful, reasoned approach. And so when they come on site and they see Sandy Andre here and they go, what's her job title? And you say what it is. And they go, what did you consider when you evaluated whether she needed to work on site? Having an answer to that and having it make sense, right? Tying it back to your business, tying it back to serving customers, all of those pieces is what MIOSHA is going to be looking for. And we don't have a crystal ball to promise you, nope, you're never going to get a citation if you make sure you say these 5 things, right? But they're signaling to us they want the employers to do the work and not have any kind of obvious misapplication or gaming of the system. Those are my thoughts, Rebecca.
Yep, I agree. And this is just also a good time to point out the difference between MIOSHA, which is enforceable law right now, and the MDHHS guidance, which is just that guidance. I can pretty much guarantee you better teamwork or those types of soft issues would not pass muster under the MDHHS guidance, which is more strict. So if you as an organization have committed to following the most restrictive guidelines because you promised your employees you would, or perhaps you think that's just the best approach, that's your business judgment, then certainly you should not consider things like that. All right, Sandy, I'm going to take a few of these questions from the live Q&A, and then while I'm doing that, I'll let you look over a few that you would like to answer. Here's one that I've received a lot and that Ken asked. Do these considerations apply to executive director level employees as well? Our HR clients that we talk to are getting quite a bit of pushback, right, from their bosses, to be blunt, who would like to come into work. So the simple answer is yes. The standards that Sandy and I have discussed apply top to bottom, from your lowest paid employee to your highest paid employee. Your executive directors, et cetera, presidents of the company, vice presidents, may have a good argument that they need to work in person because they need to supervise, right, and see what's happening with the operations, react quickly, all of those kinds of things. So we can discuss the specifics with you and decide whether there is a good argument that they really cannot feasibly work remotely, but the standard is the same for everybody. Another question, if the MDHHS guidance had been in the MDHHS order, would it then have been binding? The answer is yes. And at one point, a version of the MDHHS order, am I putting 3 H's in there? I feel like let's just call it Health and Human Services guidance. At one point, the order from that department did contain workplace safety restrictions, and that was the law of the land. And then MIOSHA issued its emergency rule, and we were all trying to figure out how to mesh those two together because the verbiage was a little different, right? The standards were just a little different. And how are we going to advise clients to comply with both? And then soon after, Health and Human Services issued an updated order which deleted the workplace safety guidelines, clearly signaling that the state was sending this issue to MIOSHA, basically, right? We were going to defer to MIOSHA for workplace safety issues. But then, as Sandy mentioned, then the governor held a press conference and Health and Human Services issued this guidance where it seems as if they are trying to exert some influence over this area. But for now, HHS is not only not in their order, they deleted it from their order, which was binding law. Sandy mentioned to keep your eyes out for legislation. Obviously, we're looking hard at that. Governor Whitmer has indicated she would like the legislature to issue, to pass a statute related to remote work requirements. My own opinion, which is not held by every lawyer at Miller Johnson, but my own opinion is it seems to me there's a conflict between different parts of the state government, so we may see some updates and revisions from either Health and Human Services or MIOSHA. So that is one of the reasons I said at the very beginning, the information we are giving you is current as of Tuesday, November 10th. I'm still saying 8:04 because I have not checked my email during this webinar. So from the time we started the webinar, it's current. We will, of course, update you with any changes. Sandy, any other themes in the questions that have come through?
Yeah, I just see one, a couple related to kind of MIOSHA enforcement. I just want to hit on those really quickly. Scott asked a great question. How does the MDHHS guidance affect the MIOSHA general duty clause or potential liability? And that's a great question. But remember, from a MIOSHA standpoint, they can cite under the general duty clause only if that type of workplace hazard is not citable under an existing standard. And so the MIOSHA emergency rule now is our standard. And so in that rule is the standard related to remote work, and their own enforcement guidance walked us through how they are going to enforce that standard. So let's just pretend their emergency rule didn't say anything about remote work, okay? I actually think the MDHHS guidance becomes a little bit more problematic for the exact reason that Scott has listed here, right? Because if they are silent on something and no standard exists, it's appropriate maybe for industry guidance to fill in the gray of what an employer's obligation under the general duty clause might be. And so maybe they would lean on this MDHHS guidance. But because they have a standard that specifically speaks to this hazard, on-site work, as the hazard we're talking about, it would not be appropriate for them to lean on the MDHHS guidance. And so, right, if that becomes an issue for you, that's the argument your attorney would likely make. I can't promise that they're not going to issue a citation, but that's kind of the legal analysis that goes along with that. One more question here related to MIOSHA. Is MIOSHA spot checking businesses for policies to be in place, or is this something triggered when they get a complaint related to your workplace? And the answer is who knows, right? So within the last couple of months, MIOSHA has instituted some, they're called SEPs, state emphasis programs, that are specifically targeted at specific industries related to their COVID mitigation measures and compliance. And those have been hospitals, retail settings, dine-in or food service establishments, those types of things. We haven't seen anything come out that says that they're starting a state emphasis program specifically related to office environments as an example, but certainly any MIOSHA safety officer who is out and about in the community absolutely can, when they see a potential unsafe work practice, can do kind of a spot inspection. Typically, we haven't seen that in this COVID world that we're living in, right? That they're generally just responsive to complaints or injuries or deaths, quite frankly, in the workplace. Those types of pieces, but safety officers certainly can. And so, yes, as we look at their enforcement guidance, remember, what did they tell us that they're looking for, right? They're looking for implementation of a policy and the existence of a policy, right? So they're going to be looking for those two things, but they evaluate the seriousness of that violation differently, right? They're focused on more on the implementation piece, but you want to make sure you hit both of those, implementation of a policy and existence of a policy and implementation of the program surrounding that policy. Another quick question here, could you please clarify if this MIOSHA policy is required for schools when it's already in the return to school plan. So I just want to be clear, when we are talking about, you know, whether you put it in your preparedness plan or you have a standalone policy, that's only to the extent that you don't already have a document that speaks to how you're evaluating this, right? So if you already have a policy or something about this in your preparedness plan or other document that talks about how you're doing this analysis, you don't need to implement something additional, right? You just need to make sure you have something somewhere. So the tools that we gave you today are kind of designed as, okay, if you've been silent on this and your analysis has kind of just been in your head, right, or on the back of a napkin kind of a situation, let's go ahead and put a little more formality to that analysis and quantify it here in writing.
Right. So, and we know, Sandy, we know schools have lots of documentation about their plan for return to work and who should be there and who should not. With that, it is 9:01. I know it's 9 o'clock because my alarm, for those of you that have done the webinars with me over the last month, you know my cell phone alarm goes off at 9 o'clock to remind me to do my health screening questionnaire at Miller Johnson. So you probably just heard my alarm go off. We will let you get on with your days. Please let us know if you have any questions or if we can help you. The forms, the policy, the updated COVID-19 plan is on our resource center. With that, Sandy and I will sign off, and we hope you all stay healthy and have a productive day. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks, everybody.